Today, I am joined by two fantastic individuals working to catalyze SDG progress, ensure no one gets left behind, and to embrace reconciliation and deep transformation in our efforts not just to build back better, but to build back differently towards Agenda 2030. First up, we have John. John McArthur is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution. He co-founded and co-chairs the 17 Rooms Initiative, a new approach to catalyzing action for the Sustainable Development Goals. Outside of Brookings, he's also a senior advisor to the UN Foundation, a member of Policy Horizons Canada's Deputy Minister Steering Committee, and a member of the Novata ESG Advisory Council. Over to you, John.
Well, thank you so much, Alicia, and what a privilege to be here and to follow Winter Dawn, who I really don't have much to add after what she shared with us, I have to say. And I'm just proud to be on the same virtual stage as her and Danika and yourself. D'abord, je voudrais vous remercier tout le monde et nos amis francophones.
I'd like to first of all thank you all and our French-speaking friends for your welcome, and particularly for all the efforts for the LDD across Canada. It is a big challenge for all of us to talk about how we can make the changes that are necessary for the second half of this 15-year period.
Today, from the native lands of the Piscataway, Nacotchtank, and Pamunkey people outside of Washington, D.C. And I am also breathing the air that has come down from Canada and is requiring my children to stay inside today because of the pollution that is in the air we all breathe together from these fires that are part of a huge set of challenges that our society is grappling with. I was like you, Alicia, born in Toronto, but grew up in Vancouver. And my hometown, it's an annual challenge now of which days we can have to worry about which air we breathe because of the fires and our imbalance in our relationship with nature. This is not unique to Canada, of course, but it's profoundly salient in Canada. And even the so-called, what used to be called the capital of the world in New York City, yesterday is on a near shutdown basis based on the fires of, what's happening in Canada. I think all of this is important as we look back to what was the ambition, the goals, the Sustainable Development Goals were meant to achieve. What's the current status of where we are today? And how might we think differently about the second half? I do have to say that I was only honored, and I want to give a shout out to John Beale when he called, as the leader of SDSN Canada to talk about this notion of the second half, which is something that some colleagues and I had started to write about, and Margaret Biggs and I, the former deputy minister, have, started to think through more seriously in the Canadian context and global context. If we think back to the ambition of the Sustainable Development Goals, there's so much in there and so much in the underlying agreements that fed into them. But I think it ultimately boiled down to three problems that every society in the world is trying to move forward on. The first is recoupling the prosperity that every family needs to see with a sense of well-being in their own lives. The second is decoupling the prosperity that is essential for families from the environmental damage that is still coming with it. And the third is what I call the we coupling, that we're all in this together. And in SDG language, that's, of course, leave no one behind. It's the challenge of reconciliation, which is so profound, and we've already heard such profound words about, and I'm sure we will hear more of the vital perspectives from Danika. But this is a crucial question around how societies need to work for everyone with equal opportunity and access to opportunity for all individuals based on any aspect of who they are. We have seen some progress in the past several years. In 8 years since 2015, there are aspects that have stepped forward in Canada and other parts of the world. We have a carbon price in Canada. That was a major generational victory with a long battle to get there. We've gone from roughly 1% of our ocean maritime area protected to roughly 15% of our maritime area protected. That is a transformational step forward, even if much work to be done for it to be everything it needs to be. We've seen child poverty decline. Where that is today, we don't know exactly, which I'll come back to, but we have seen dramatic steps forward on challenges that are still to be taken forward. But we have also seen globally a sense of being stuck. We have war in Europe, which we had learned to count on as a place that was at peace. We've seen the issues of climate change drive through the heart of how the international system works. It's not just about how countries cooperate, but it's about this tension between what is often discussed as a rules-based international order, but feels to many societies around the world as at best a two sets of rules-based international order. And who gets to decide what on behalf of whom, and how this global challenge of the commons is taken forward is a deep fissure in how the world even thinks about how to cooperate. We have deep challenges of how we think about how we help each other tackle our problems. This is why countries or institutions like the World Bank and the United Nations are talking about the need to do things dramatically differently themselves. The way they were wired in 1960 is not fit for purpose to the challenges of 2023, let alone 2030. We are not a set, in my view, of united nations. We need to be working on uniting communities in order to bring people together around the challenges that they share. But in that spirit, there are sources of hope internationally. We see dramatic inroads still in tackling infectious disease. The challenge of HIV/AIDS, which I know I have spent a fair share of time on in my career, and others, I'm sure across this meeting today have too. We are seeing that that is actually an area that is still making better and better progress around the world. And it's gone from impossible to tackle a generation ago to doing better and better every year today. We've seen universities around the world not be the slowest moving institutions, as they're often described, but being some of the most innovative and pioneering institutions to help lead new forms of problem solving within and across constituencies and increasingly with their own communities. We've seen more and more communities, you referenced the VLRs, Alicia, the voluntary local reviews, start to take the goals into their own hands to say, what does this mean for us? But I think all of this represents ingredients of progress, but not yet enough. We need a new approach for the second half. We need to move from what I would call too much tinkering, too much SDG washing, and we need a sense of how we can work differently together. In Canada, I would argue across the country that the provinces are equally crucial and maybe missing in action sometimes, even when the communities are in the lead. I think the federal government the Auditor General has pointed out repeatedly some of the gaps. The Assembly of First Nations, and I'm sure Danika will talk more about this, has been, very clear that it was terrific that the government called an integration of reconciliation with the SDGs, but then why were they not consulted in the national strategy? These are deep tensions that need to be reconciled. But ultimately, I believe we can do so through a few key ingredients. First, people are often impeded from approaching the SDGs because they think they're too big, too far off, and I don't go to the United Nations. What does that mean for me? In my view, the way we tackle this is by making them about next steps in our own communities and what we can do together, because these goals will only succeed if communities around the world can take them into their own hands. That means that we need real-time information and data on how we're doing on each of these challenges. Every postal code in Canada should be able to see how it's doing across all the goals, in my view, in a transparent dashboard that any journalist or activist could look at to see, why is this part doing better in their community than mine? But we also need intergenerational collaboration. We need leaders of all ages in all sectors to be thinking about how the wisdom of our elders in all walks of life, again, I'm sure Danika and other colleagues can teach us much about how we might think better about this across Canada and around the world. But we need to tap into the pioneering spirit of youth, as we just heard, to think differently about how the world can look different by 2030 and beyond. I have seen in university after university, the surveys show that the students care more about this than the faculty. Well, I'm of the view that the young people are usually right. And we need to listen to the young people and tap into their fresh perspective and harness their energies. But it's not about any individual perspective. It's about how we are all in this together. So I'm thrilled that this conference is doing things differently. I'm thrilled that so many leaders across the country are thinking about how to do things differently. But I actually think we need to double down on doing things differently in order to have a chance of these goals representing the ambition that we all hope for come to life in a way that makes it much more meaningful for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John, and hear to doing things differently. Next to John today, we have Danika. Danika Billy Littlechild is a member of the Ermineskin Cree Nation in Treaty 6 territory in Alberta. Danika practiced law for 2 decades before becoming an assistant professor at Carleton University, serving as an advisor to and representative of Indigenous peoples with a particular focus on environment, health, and the rights of Indigenous peoples. Danika was general counsel for the International Indian Treaty Council from 2011 to 2018 and was one of the participants in the Indigenous Peoples Major Group during negotiations of the SDGs. Danika currently leads the Aramat Project and holds a joint UNESCO chair on collaboration for Indigenous-led biodiversity conservation, health, and well-being. Over to you, Danika.
Hi, Tansatoya Kakeo Kinanaskum Denawao Ota Bentumiak. I'm very honored to be invited to speak with you all today from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatchewan, not in Alberta. And I'm really pleased to be able to speak to this important topic of the second half of the SDGs. I think a very primary and fundamental point for me is that the SDGs cannot be conceived as successfully implemented in a context of injustice. As we heard from the wonderful introductory words of our Indigenous youth who really, I think, put us on the right path this morning, there are some fundamental issues around ways and means of Indigenous participation, inclusion, and leadership, which is fundamentally rejected on a great many levels, not just in the context of the SDGs, but also in the context of any frameworks, institutions, infrastructure that we currently have to try to implement the SDGs. So this is really problematic. I think from my perspective, the other challenge with the SDGs and Indigenous peoples in Canada is that we struggle in Canada with the fact that much of the ideation, concepts, approaches that emerge around how to engage with Indigenous peoples on international issues or standard setting is very often mired in law and policy, which is not of our making. Laws and policies that have been passed by federal, provincial, territorial governments, policies that are engaged in those various government levels, as well as within civil society organizations who have very specific ideas themselves about how to work with Indigenous peoples. And so I think for me, these are a few very large kind of paradigmatic issues that we have to grapple with in the context of the SDGs. From my perspective, we do have something to work with in the context of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Why is that declaration important? Well, it is the only UN instrument that comprehensively describes the minimum standards that are to be expected in the way we think about Indigenous peoples and their rights within both the human rights frameworks as well as within rights as we conceive of them in connection to environment, in connection to the nation states in which we exist, and many, many other aspects. And so it is very encouraging that the federal government has now passed legislation to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. However, the measures that are used for this implementation do not adequately address how we could understand potential linkages with the SDGs. And why do I say this? Because sort of the reporting on how we're doing on implementing the UN Declaration in Canada is fairly restricted. It is important that we take a disaggregated approach in the context of Indigenous peoples, as our youth pointed out in her introductory remarks, around a distinctions-based approach. We need to understand the incredible diversity of Indigenous peoples across Canada. Now, if we think about these contexts of injustice, imbalance of power, land grabs, land appropriation, criminalization of Indigenous land defenders that is ongoing to this day, we really must comprehend the real barriers to effective implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this was no less reflected in the lead up to and the negotiations of the SDGs all those years ago, which I was part of. At that time, I was General Counsel for International Indian Treaty Council. Some of you may know that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was passed by resolution at the UN General Assembly in 2007. And so there was a lot of people who were participating in the Indigenous Peoples Major Group who were very much looking forward to seeing how a standard setting process like the SDGs would take into account the very important, fundamental, historic role that the UN Declaration plays in describing how we move forward together internationally as well as at domestic levels with respect to the rights of Indigenous peoples. But we were unfortunately quite let down in those processes. In the few years before the SDGs were finalized, I was also part of negotiations for the Minamata Convention on Mercury, which was the first multilateral environmental agreement to be completed after the passage of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there were a few key states there who basically prevented the inclusion of the phrase Indigenous peoples in the operative text of that convention. Why did they oppose that? I was told by the head of delegation of France that France would never recognize Indigenous peoples as a phrase in a legally binding treaty. And I was told that this was sort of a national position that they were taking that had nothing to do with any colonies or fears about the realization of Indigenous rights and addressing injustice. The UK was also a real big supporter of that position. So our two treaty partners, our original two treaty partners here in Canada, the UK and France. And I did not participate in most of the negotiations for the SDGs. I was brought in at the final set of negotiations in 2015. I think because people knew that what was happening at the SDGs was what had happened in the Minamata Convention. France was once again leading the charge of a small cohort of countries who were opposing completely the inclusion of the phrase Indigenous peoples or reference to Indigenous peoples in the text of the SDGs, either in the goals or targets. And they, of course, very strongly opposed the citation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, even in the preambular text of the SDGs. Why does this all matter? It matters because the United Nations is an institution that is run by and for states. It is not an independent arbiter of human rights. There are independent experts within the UN system that address human rights issues and try to help us understand how to implement those treaties and take countries to task on their failure to meet their legal obligations under conventions like human rights conventions or multilateral environmental agreements. But the final issue for Indigenous peoples is that many states oppose the inclusion of Indigenous peoples because they are concerned about what the recognition of Indigenous rights might mean for their domestic laws, for their positionality vis-a-vis lands that they may have appropriated, resources that they may have appropriated without free, prior, and informed consent, for example. And what we saw was in the final negotiations in the SDGs, we saw Bolivia, who was then head of the G77 in those negotiations, telling the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, look, France is taking a hardline position. Again, they don't want Indigenous peoples in the text. They don't want the UN Declaration in. So I went to talk to France, and France said, Danika, I'm going to give you 10 minutes to discuss this issue with me, because during the Minamata Convention, I took hours of their time. They said, no, this time we're only giving you 10 minutes to talk to us about our position on Indigenous peoples and their inclusion. So Indigenous Peoples Major Group had 10 minutes to convince France to change their position. I, to this day, don't know why France ultimately changed their position to allow for the inclusion of the phrase Indigenous peoples in the text of the SDGs. We argued that this was because the SDGs was not a legally binding process, that this would not violate the position they took under the Minamata Convention. And we also told them that this process of intergovernmental negotiations on standards like the SDGs meant that France should not and ought not to be allowed to impose their national views and to influence the ability of other countries who did want to recognize Indigenous peoples to be able to do so within the operative text of the SDGs. Unfortunately, we were not able to get the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to be adequately cited. And we only ended up in, I believe there were 6 mentions of Indigenous peoples in the text of the SDGs. When we began negotiations, I think we were in 9 of the goals, and that was winnowed down to 2 goals, and the rest were target citations. So why am I sort of parsing numbers and where we were, et cetera? It matters because in the context of Indigenous peoples' experience with nation states like Canada and other countries in the world, so much of how we express our representation, our participation, is very closely tied to law. And our experience has been that if you're not in the operative text, you will be left behind. Where we cannot cite, for example, the goal on clean water and say, oh, well, it's really unfortunate that Indigenous peoples weren't featured strongly in that goal, so that we could then use that to say, here's the operative text of the SDGs, here's how it ties to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and here's how that ought to be implemented within Canada. These things become very challenging when you're facing people at a boardroom table who say, well, yes, we've got the SDGs, but that's for all Canadians. We don't really want to get too deep, too mired in Indigenous rights, because then we'd have to involve the Department of Justice, who would give us the green light, yellow light, red light as to whether these interpretations of the SDGs are appropriate in the context of rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada. See, this is how problematic and challenging it really becomes. And I think from my perspective, and I want to wrap up in the next minute because I know there are probably questions. From my perspective, I believe that we are in a very critical time, in which if we could sort of rally the allies within civil society to talk about Indigenous peoples with every citation of any SDG, to normalize the inclusion of normally peripheralized and vulnerable peoples in the context of goals in which they are not mentioned, in which they were not included. I think this is really fundamental. I think it's problematic to say, leave no one behind, but refuse to name us. That's a huge problem for me. And finally, I will just say that when you do your advocacy around Indigenous peoples and the SDGs, please do not forget the S at the end of peoples. It represents all of our diversity, and it is also a marker of the struggle. It took 11 years to negotiate that S in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It took 11 years for Indigenous peoples lobbying at those negotiations, because of course they weren't the negotiators, the states were. It took 11 years. They wore t-shirts with S's on them. They had hunger strikes. They finally got the S. Why does it matter? Because Indigenous peoples have self-determination under the UN Charter, further to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because we are peoples, not populations, not groups, not issues. We are peoples with human rights. Hi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danika, for just highlighting how deep this transformation has to go. We're not just talking about institutions like the World Bank and the IMF changing, but the UN system, or even the way that we operate as a global community together, moving beyond states to nation and community to community collaborations towards the actualization, if outside of the SDG framing, the actualization of a future that is sustainable, that is prosperous, that is just and inclusive of us all. For those folks tuning in, I hope that you're actively on social media using the hashtag #TogetherOnSome2023. Post your questions, post your thoughts, post your reflections, and hopefully I've come up with a couple good ones that we can dive into now. So John, in one of your latest pieces in the Brookings Institute, you posited that the impact of the SDGs has been largely discursive in both the public and private sectors. And that was just like a aha moment for me. Like, what can we do in Canada, do you think, to ensure that we're moving from rhetoric, from virtue signaling, from SDG washing to actual transformative action? And I know you touched on some of those ingredients in your earlier remarks, but what do you think it's really going to take to make that shift?
Well, thank you. And I just have to say, I found Danika's quick history there extremely informative. And even I live and breathe the SDGs, and there's bits there I didn't know before. And just as a factoid in the broader quest for justice that she rightly underscores, I had read paragraph 52 just to be specific of the jargon, which talks about we the peoples and all the different forms of peoples, including Indigenous peoples. in the 2030 agenda agreement. But then I just looked back at the open working group from the year before, which was the original draft, and it had two very brief references only in the targets, exactly as she said. And I just salute all the work that went into getting that paragraph in that following year, knowing how much, because the paragraph strikes me as the direction it should be going in the latest version, but it just shows how it's a direction, not anything more. These are directions of travel, and here we are 8 years later with all the issues that are deeper. So I think that's part of my answer to your question, is to understand the depth of the direction of travel that's needed on many of these things, and to be very explicit about that largely discursive line. That was a quote from an academic study in one of the world's major journals evaluating in a meta-study how much the SDGs have actually been taken on. And it's seen a lot of rhetoric, a lot of rhetorical adoption of these words, and what Margaret Biggs calls, SDG clip art, of people putting a goal on something they're already doing, or, oh, I'm a company that works in healthcare, therefore I care about SDG 3. But that's not wrong to be drawing the connection between goals and what we care about. But that's a very first step of a much bigger journey that's needed, where the goals were set not to celebrate what was already doing. The goals were set as stretch goals to do things differently. And the deepest point is that we have not been doing enough things differently enough. And so even I give credit to many people in the federal government who've been trying very hard to make progress on this. But I think, again, the Auditor General draws attention to it's not enough. And I think the question should be safe for the federal government and the provincial and territorial and any community government that says it cares about this. Every time they make a policy announcement, just as it should include, I would wholly support, what does this mean for Indigenous peoples? It should include, what does this mean for the SDGs? What is the metric against which this will be assessed in 2030? How will this bend a curve compared to what was already happening anyhow? That can be a norm and a practice at all levels of community and all levels of government. There's a crucial need, I would argue, for literally getting people together, ensemble, in a national conference. I would argue we need people from every province and territory, from First Nations across the countries and Indigenous communities, to come together to say, what are we going to do as next steps? Because so much of this literally does come down to people getting together in rooms to say, what could we do differently next? There will be a federal election before too long in Canada. That is a great moment to say, well, these were agreed under a conservative-led government and they've been pursued under a liberal-led government. It's not partisan. The debate isn't whether to get there. The debate is how to get there. That's for every journalist, every academic, every civil society leader, every young person in every community town hall or every door knock to say, how can we get there differently? I do believe measurement matters. I think it's not to be overly reductive in the deeper quest for justice, which is so fundamental, but it is to track what we're doing differently. And I do believe that community level goal setting processes around what to do differently by when really, really matters, and who can take responsibility for that difference. So there are lots of things around data systems and metric setting and so forth. But I think a lot of it comes back to, as Danika said, what is the question that gets asked with every announcement? And the question needs to be, how is this consistent with what everyone has promised we're trying to do? And it really matters that the promise exists, because just like if the words aren't on the paper, it's harder to follow up with the advocacy. If the promise exists, then all we're doing is helping people follow through on the promise, because that's the purpose of these goals, in my view.
Thank you very much for that contribution. And thank goodness we're here today all together as a country to dive into these issues over the next 3 days. Danika, like John was saying, thank you so much for this, historical perspective of what has happened. And it reminded me also of the UNDRIP process, by which it took many, many years for UNDRIP to even be accepted at the UN level for the very same reasons that you highlighted, of just acknowledging, historical land grabs and what that would mean if we were to actually acknowledge Indigenous people's rights across the world. I'm curious, you shared the call for allies to rally together to talk about Indigenous peoples in every single citation. As we look towards the next 7 years, towards 2030 and beyond, how do you think that we can accelerate SDG progress and our work on truth and reconciliation in tandem?
That's a big question. I say that's a big, hairy question. Look, the TRC calls to action said the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the framework for reconciliation. Why did the commissioners say that? Why did they try to describe the framework for reconciliation? As was mentioned earlier by the Indigenous youth who opened us in a good way today, reconciliation is not a destination. And it's something that we will constantly be engaging in. And the UN Declaration as a set of minimum standards, being the floor, not the ceiling. This is not an aspirational document at the UN. It's intended to set the minimum standard of rights to be expected for Indigenous peoples. And if you can believe it, France endorsed it. In spite of their positionality in other fora at the international level. Canada was one of the countries who opposed it, who voted against it at the General Assembly in 2007. And Canada was, in fact, the last country of all opposing countries to change their position. Canada did not change its position on the UN Declaration until 2016, and then another sort of add-on in 2017. What was the add-on? In 2016, they went to the UN and they said, yes, we endorse the UN Declaration, except for free, prior, and informed consent. And then they thought about it for a year, took some advice, went back to the UN and said, we actually do now endorse free, prior, and informed consent. What was the concern around that? A lot of ill-informed rhetoric around an idea of a veto being held by Indigenous peoples with regard to development. I would say probably other rationale as well that I'm certainly not privy to. But all this to say that if we think about reconciliation in a substantive way and not in a way that is about rhetoric, about patting ourselves on the back, about feeling better about the work that we do. Oh, our constituting documents of our NGO have reference to TRC UN Declaration. Well, I wonder how many people have read it, those two documents. They're not long, but it's very rare that I encounter people who cite those documents who have actually read them through and thought deeply about what they might mean for their work, for the advocacy platforms that they put together, for how they understand where their office is situated, the territories in which they do their work, and being thoughtful about what that might mean for allyship of Indigenous peoples. And so I think from my perspective, it really is about challenging ourselves and being deep critical thinkers about the interaction between our commitment now to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and our purported commitment to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals as we come into the second half. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danika. Thank you both. I wish I could sit and chat with you about this all day long, but unfortunately we are out of time. What what a great conversation. What a great way to start us off for the next 3 days. So I really thank you for your time, your contributions, and your ongoing work in communities. And thank you all to the audience for tuning in live. I hope that you continue to engage, take these reflections as we get into the workshops and the other live stream sessions. I believe next we're headed east to Université Laval to talk about AI and the SDGs. See you there.
Thank you so much. Merci tout le monde.
Thank you. Hi.